What if I told you that the mush-mouthed, gravel-throated deputy who limped around Dodge City for 11 years, the one who could barely string a sentence together without mangling it, had one of the most beautiful singing voices in America? That before he was Festus Haggen, this man stood behind the same microphone as Frank Sinatra. And replaced him? Here's the paradox nobody talks about. Ken Curtis spent his whole early life building the most polished voice money could buy. Big band, Cowboy harmony, Carnegie Hall. And then, at the peak of his fame, he took that gorgeous instrument and buried it under a hillbilly rasp so ugly it made audiences laugh. 3 things I want you to hold on to as we go. First, the voice America never got to remember. Second, the strange price this proud man paid just to belong to Hollywood royalty. And third, the reason his ashes were finally scattered across an empty stretch of Colorado dirt. By the end of this, you're going to understand why the most forgettable deputy in television history was hiding the most remarkable life. Let's count it down. Number 1. The boy who carried supper to killers. Curtis Wayne Gates came into the world on July 2, 1916, in Lamar, Colorado. Flat country, hard country. The kind of place where a family's fortunes rose and fell with the weather. For his first 10 years, he lived on a ranch on Muddy Creek. Then, in 1926, everything changed. His father, Dan Gates, ran for sheriff of Bent County, and he won it. So the family packed up and moved into the county jail in Los Animas. Let that settle for a second. This future television star grew up sleeping in a jailhouse. The living quarters were downstairs. The cells were upstairs. And young Curtis had a chore most boys never dreamed of. Years later, in 1967, he described it plainly. His mother cooked the meals for the prisoners, and he was the one who carried those meals up those stairs to the cells, while his mother stood behind him holding a shotgun in case one of the men got, in his words, frisky. Think about what that does to a boy. He learned early that dangerous men were just men, that the line between the law and the lawless ran right through his own kitchen. He would spend the rest of his career on the frontier of exactly that line. But here's the thing about a kid from the Colorado flatlands. When you grow up watching the whole world through iron bars, you start to dream about somewhere else. So what does a jailhouse boy do when he wants to escape? Number 2, the voice that could have made him a star. He sang his way out. Curtis had a gift, and everybody around him knew it. A smooth, warm, effortless voice. He played clarinet in the high school band, quarterbacked the football team, and then enrolled at Colorado College to study medicine. Medicine didn't last. The music was too loud in him. Around 1938, he pointed himself toward Los Angeles and landed work as a staff singer at NBC Radio. No small thing for a kid off a Colorado ranch. And understand what kind of voice we're talking about. This was not some amateur crooner. This was a genuine, trained, radio-quality baritone. The sort of voice that could fill a ballroom and make strangers stop their conversations. Here's the cruel irony that hangs over this entire story. The millions of people who would eventually love Ken Curtis never once heard him sing the way God built him to sing. They only knew the wheeze and the twang of Festus. The beautiful voice was real. It was the first thing about him that the world would eventually forget. Remember that. We'll come back to it. So how good was he? Really? Good enough that one of the biggest band leaders in America came calling. And good enough to fill the shoes of the most famous singer alive. How does a jailhouse boy end up replacing Frank Sinatra? Number 3. Standing where Sinatra stood. In 1941, the phone rang for the big time. Tommy Dorsey ran one of the most powerful orchestras in the country, and his young vocalist, a skinny kid named Frank Sinatra, was on his way to becoming the biggest solo star on the planet. Dorsey needed a voice he could count on. He hired Curtis Gates. And Dorsey did something else. He looked at the name Curtis Gates and decided it wasn't right for a marquee, so he handed the young man a brand new identity. From that day forward, the world would know him as Ken Curtis. Now, let's be honest and precise, because this is where the legend gets stretched. Curtis did not permanently dethrone Sinatra. He came in as Dorsey's insurance in 1941, covering as Sinatra prepared to launch his solo career. The permanent replacement contractually, was a singer named Dick Haymes in 1942. But strip away the fine print, and the truth is still staggering. For a window of time, a boy who carried supper to prisoners in a Colorado jail stood in the exact spot where Frank Sinatra stood, singing to the exact same crowds. That is not a footnote. That is a miracle of ambition. He wasn't finished with music either. He sang with the band leader Shep Fields and kept recording. Then the war came, and Ken Curtis traded the bandstand for a uniform. He served in the United States Army in World War II, over in Italy, far from any stage or spotlight. And when the war ended, the frontier that was calling him wasn't the ballroom anymore. It was the open range. What happens when a big band singer trades his tuxedo for a saddle? Number 4, the Cowboy in Perfect Harmony. In 1949, Ken Curtis joined an American institution. The Sons of the Pioneers were the greatest singing cowboy group in the world. They'd been founded back in 1933 by a young man named Leonard Sly, who you know better as Roy Rogers. Their harmonies had defined the sound of the mythic West. Curtis stepped in as a lead singer and stayed, in one form or another, through the mid-1950s. This was cowboy royalty, and now he was one of them. The songs they sang defined a whole American feeling. Tumbling Tumbleweeds, Ghost Riders in the Sky. These weren't just hit records. They were the soundtrack of the West that a whole generation carried in its heart. And Curtis wasn't a background hummer in that group. He was a lead voice, standing shoulder to shoulder with the men who'd invented the singing cowboy sound in the first place. When the Sons of the Pioneers cut a record in those years, it was Ken Curtis out front, carrying the melody. He had reached the absolute summit of a world he'd only dreamed about from a Colorado jailhouse. And here's the measure of how far the jailhouse boy had climbed. The Sons of the Pioneers performed at Carnegie Hall, the most prestigious stage in the nation. A Colorado ranch kid, standing on that hallowed platform, filling it with cowboy harmony. By any normal measure, Ken Curtis had already arrived. He'd conquered the big bands. He'd conquered the singing cowboy world. He was, at that moment, a genuine music star with a voice people would pay real money to hear. So remember that, because everything that comes next is a man walking away from the thing he was best at. Why would a successful singer abandon the stage for the movie lots and a strange, powerful new father-in-law? Number 5. The Singing Cowboy on the Columbia lot. Hollywood came knocking in the middle of it all. Columbia Pictures signed Curtis back in 1945, and he became exactly what his voice promised. A singing cowboy leading man in a string of low-budget westerns, riding and crooning alongside a novelty act called the Hoosier Hotshots. These were not great films. They were the bread and butter of the B-Western factory, cranked out fast and cheap for Saturday afternoon crowds. But they put Ken Curtis on horseback, in front of a camera, and taught him how movies actually got made. It was honest work, and it was a foothold. The kid who dreamed his way out of a jailhouse was now a working screen cowboy. But B-Westerns were a dead-end street. The genre was fading, and a man could ride those cheap pictures into total obscurity. Curtis needed something bigger. He needed to break into the real Hollywood, the world of prestige pictures and legendary directors. And the door to that world was about to open, through a marriage that would cost him almost as much as it gave him. What would a proud man do to get inside the most exclusive circle in Hollywood? Number 6. The Price of Belonging to a Legend. In 1952, Ken Curtis married Barbara Ford. That name matters more than any studio contract, because Barbara was the daughter of John Ford, the single most important director in the history of the Western. The man who made John Wayne a legend and turned Monument Valley into sacred ground. Overnight, Curtis wasn't just a fading B-Western singer. He was John Ford's son-in-law. He had married into Hollywood's most powerful filmmaking dynasty, and the doors that had been closed to him swung wide open. But here is the uncomfortable truth underneath the glamour, and it tells you everything about how badly this man wanted to belong. According to Ford's biographer, Curtis made himself endlessly useful to the old director. He was always available. He ran errands. He served, in the biographer's words, almost as a valet to the great man. And it went further than errands. The accounts describe Curtis staying in Ford's good graces by doing tasks no self-respecting star would touch. He would, on occasion, trim the aging director's toenails, sit with that image, a man who once replaced Frank Sinatra, a man who sang at Carnegie Hall, kneeling to clip an old man's toenails just to keep his seat at the table. That is the second thread I asked you to remember. The strange, humbling price of belonging. Was it worth it? For a while, it absolutely was, because that connection put Ken Curtis into some of the greatest films ever made. But did he ever really earn his place, or just marry into it? Number 7, where Festus was actually born. The Ford connection paid off on screen in 1956. Curtis appeared in The Searchers, widely called the greatest Western ever committed to film, as a rough-edged suitor named Charlie McCory. He'd go on to work in a whole run of Ford pictures. The Wings of Eagles, The Horse Soldiers, Two Rode Together, How the West Was Won, Cheyenne Autumn. He was no longer a B-lister. He was a working member of John Ford's legendary stock company, sharing frames with John Wayne and the biggest names in the business. For a man who'd started out crooning in throwaway B-westerns, this was a mountaintop he had no business reaching. But something happened on the set of The Searchers that would define the rest of his life, and he never saw it coming. Between takes, Curtis started clowning around. He dropped into a dry, backcountry, mushmouth dialect, the kind of talk he remembered from the dirt-poor characters of his Colorado youth. It was a joke, pure goofing off, and John Ford overheard him. The old director stopped, listened, and told him to use that voice in the picture. Just like that, a romantic scene got rewritten into a comedy scene. The strange, twangy, unforgettable voice of Festus Haggen was born, years early, as an accident on a movie set. Curtis based it on a real man from Las Animas, a cedar post cutter called Cedar Jack, who often ended up drunk in his father's jail. The jailhouse boy was about to make a fortune imitating one of his father's own prisoners. But before television called, Curtis tried something almost nobody remembers. He decided he didn't just want to act in movies. He wanted to control them. What does a singing cowboy do when he turns into a monster movie mogul? Number 8, The Man Who Made Monsters. In 1959, Ken Curtis became a movie producer of monsters. He teamed up with a Texas radio mogul named Gordon McLendon and cranked out two of the most gloriously cheap horror pictures of the era, The Killer Shrews and The Giant Gila Monster. The Killer Shrews is a legend of low-budget filmmaking. The terrifying killer shrews were, in reality, German shepherd dogs draped in shaggy carpet costumes, staggering around a single location. The whole thing was made for roughly $123,000. And here's the punchline that would make any businessman weep with envy. That silly little movie about carpet-covered dogs reportedly grossed around $1 million. Curtis, the jailhouse boy turned crooner, turned cowboy, had just turned a monster movie joke into a fortune. It tells you something crucial about him. He was never just a pretty voice being carried along by his father-in-law. He had hustle. He understood something the snobs never did, that a scared teenager at a drive-in on a Saturday night would happily pay to watch dogs in carpet costumes. He had a nose for what ordinary audiences actually wanted, and he was willing to bet his own money on himself when the smart people in Hollywood laughed at him. That instinct, that feel for the common audience, was about to serve him better than anything else he'd ever done, because a television western was looking for a new face. And Ken Curtis was about to make the biggest, strangest gamble of his career. Would you throw away a beautiful voice for a role that made you look like a fool? Number 9. Burying the beautiful voice forever. In 1964, Ken Curtis became Festus Haggen, and the smooth-voiced crooner disappeared for good. He'd actually first played Festus back in 1962, in an episode built around the Haggen clan. Audiences noticed him, and when Dennis Weaver left Gunsmoke, giving up the beloved sidekick role of Chester, the producers needed a replacement. They handed the badge to Curtis, so he made his choice. He took that gorgeous, trained Carnegie Hall voice, and he buried it, completely. He wheezed, he drawled, he mangled his grammar. He rode a mule named Ruth, and squinted, and scratched, and became the scruffiest deputy in the history of the frontier. And he committed to it totally. Festus couldn't read or write. He smelled like his mule. He got into fistfights and feuds and shouting matches with Doc, and audiences adored every second of it. Curtis built that character out of a real man he'd known as a boy, a cedar cutter who'd landed in his father's jail, and he gave him a heart as big as the Colorado sky. Nobody watching ever guessed the actor underneath had sung at Carnegie Hall. And here is the first thread paying off, the one I asked you to hold on to from the very beginning. The beautiful voice America never got to remember? Ken Curtis killed it himself, on purpose. For a laugh and a paycheck. He chose to be loved as a fool rather than admired as a singer. It worked beyond anyone's wildest dreams. He played Festus for 11 years, longer than any other deputy in the show's entire run. Some counts put him at over 300 episodes. He became one of the most beloved characters in television, touring rodeos and fairs, adored by millions. But every audience laughing at that mushmouth deputy was laughing at a disguise. Underneath the rasp was a man who could have outsung half of Nashville. He'd made himself small so that America could feel big and warm and at home. And nobody knew what he'd given up. The triumph was total. But what did it cost the man behind the badge, and where does a jailhouse boy go when the show finally ends? Number 10, The Long Road Back to Colorado Dirt. The role that made him famous had already cost him the man who made him possible. Remember John Ford, and the toenails, and the price of belonging? In 1964, the very year Festus became a regular, Ken Curtis and Barbara Ford divorced. And when the marriage ended, so did his place in John Ford's world. The old director had one narrative feature left in him, and then he was gone in 1973. So the second thread pays off, and it stings. All that kneeling, all that service, all that swallowed pride to belong to Ford's dynasty. And in the end, the marriage broke, and the connection died with it. What he'd humbled himself to earn, he could not keep. But Curtis, to his credit, did not collapse. In 1966, he married Tori Connolly, and that marriage lasted, all the way to the end of his life. He kept working. He voiced a character in Disney's Robin Hood. He co-starred in a Western series called The Yellow Rose in the 1980s. He toured, he sang for old fans, and he was inducted into the Western Performers Hall of Fame in 1981. There's one last story that shows you the proud man underneath the scruff. When Gunsmoke was revived for a reunion movie in 1987, the producers wanted Festus back. Curtis wanted to be paid what he felt he was worth, benchmarked to his old castmates. When they refused, he walked. He would rather stay home than be undervalued. The jailhouse boy had his dignity to the very end. And think about what that dignity was built on. This was a man who had conquered radio, conquered the big bands, conquered the singing cowboy world, produced his own hit movies, and then spent 11 years as one of the most beloved faces in America. He didn't need the reunion. He'd already lived 3 or 4 full careers most performers would kill for. So when the money insulted him, he simply walked away. The same quiet self-respect he'd carried since he was a boy on those jailhouse stairs. On April 28, 1991, Ken Curtis died in his sleep in Fresno, California, of a heart attack. He was 74 years old. And here is the third thread, the one I promised you at the start. They cremated him, and they scattered his ashes across the flat, empty Colorado dirt he'd come from. The boy who carried supper to prisoners, who replaced Sinatra, who sang at Carnegie Hall, who trimmed a legend's toenails and then buried his own beautiful voice to become America's favorite fool, went home, at last, to the flatlands that made him. He spent his whole life running from that Colorado dirt. And in the end, it's exactly where he chose to rest. So here's the question I'll leave you with. Ken Curtis had one of the finest voices of his generation, and he traded it for a mule named Ruth and a badge in Dodge City. Was that a tragedy, or was it the smartest, bravest choice a performer ever made? Because millions of us never knew he could sing, but not one of us has ever forgotten Festus. If this story moved you, do one thing for the old deputy. Leave a comment and tell me, did you ever know Ken Curtis could sing like that? I read every single one. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you on the next one. Thank you for watching the complete video. Did you know? Americans over 60 lost $7.7 billion to scams last year. That's according to the FBI. In 2020, that number was just 600 million. These aren't careless people. These are retired teachers, veterans, business owners, losing an average of $83,000 each. Now ask yourself this. Could you spot a phone call that uses your grandson's cloned voice, begging for help? Would you recognize a fake email from your bank that looks exactly like the real thing? Do you know what to do in the first 60 minutes after your personal information is stolen? If you hesitated on any of those, you're not alone. And that's exactly why we started The Lookout, a newsletter with one email per week. No spam, no politics. Just the latest scams explained, how they work, and exactly how to protect yourself and the people you love. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. It costs nothing. It takes 2 minutes to read, and it might save you everything.